Thanks. So the title of my presentation is More Intuition in Philosophy, Bergson and Analytic Philosophy. In this presentation, I want to show how analytic philosophy and Bergsonian philosophy can mutually enrich each other. In the first part, I will try to show that analytic philosophy and Bergsonian philosophy differ in terms of method, but that the two methods can complement and enrich each other. And in the second part, I will illustrate what I said in the first part by using a specific example, that of the problem of free will. This problem is now a classic in analytic philosophy, and it is addressed by Bergson in his first book, Time and Free Will. So first part, entitled Bergson and Analytic Philosophy, two different but complementary philosophical efforts. First, I will try to characterize what is called analytic philosophy. Of course, it's very difficult. Analytic philosophy refers, the expression analytic philosophy refers to a vast body of philosophical work that stretches from the end of the 19th century with Frege and Russell to the present day. And there is a great variety in the questions addressed, in the thesis defended, and even in the methods. Consequently, as Hans Johann Glock points out in his book, What is Analytic Philosophy? It is not possible to give a definition of analytic philosophy that clearly distinguishes what belongs to this philosophy and what does not. So to characterize this philosophical tradition, we must therefore proceed differently. A relatively simple way to proceed is as follows. We can make the hypothesis that there has been a certain unity of philosophical activity since its origins in ancient Greece, and that the difference between the diverse philosophical traditions can be explained by the fact that each tradition has more or less developed this or that aspect of philosophical activity. According to this hypothesis, analytic philosophy cannot be sharply distinguished from the rest of philosophy. In fact, it is, as Glock says, and it's the same for Bergsonian philosophy. But each has more or less developed a certain aspect of philosophical activity. So concerning analytic philosophy, my reasoning is as follows. It seems indisputable, at least I think, that there is no philosophy without a minimum of analysis of language. And this is due to the fact that philosophy is an activity that uses language, a point that Bergson stretches. Now, in the analytic tradition, this aspect of philosophical work is considerably developed with the help of modern logic. In analytical work, this analysis of language is done at several levels, at the level of concepts, statements, arguments, and even theories in the philosophy of science. In addition, we find different types of analysis: syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic. But we always find the idea that analysis breaks down something complex into simpler elements. Thus, for any statement, we can say that syntactic analysis distinguishes the different logical elements that compose the statement. Semantic analysis distinguishes its different possible meanings, and pragmatic analysis distinguishes the different actions that this statement can produce. I add that the main goal of analysis is always the clarification of statements. As far as possible, a philosophical writing must be clear. I mean, it's a real, the main standard in analytic philosophy. Clear, that is comprehensible. This is a necessary condition for judging the truth value of this writing. Now I turn to Bergson. Unlike analytic philosophy, Bergsonian philosophy concerns only one philosopher, so it can be characterized by its position. I mean, it's different theses about nature. But for the purpose of comparison with analytic philosophy, it is interesting to characterize it by its method. And with the idea, this hypothesis of a certain unity of philosophical activity. Thus, it seems indisputable that there is no philosophy without a minimum of consideration of what appears immediately to consciousness. Here, immediately means without a priori, or at least with as few a priori as possible. This is probably due to several reasons, but the main reason is the following. Initially, philosophy is a project of knowledge of reality, of all or part of reality. And at first glance, this project implies taking into account what appears to consciousness with as few a priori as possible, just because our a priori beliefs can be erroneous. So we need the consideration of what appears immediately to consciousness. Now, in Bergson's philosophy, this consideration is considerably developed, and it is developed in particular in the direction of what common sense calls the mind. In this sense, in the creative mind, which is a book mainly devoted to a method in philosophy, Bergson asserts that the principal element of method in philosophy is intuition. And it characterizes intuition as the direct vision of something. This means a vision that is independent of language and existing concepts. From a certain point of view, by saying that intuition is the direct vision of something, I think we have said everything. However, we must add two remarks in order to better understand what intuition is according to Bergson. First remark, for Bergson, intuition bears on everything that appears. I mean, both on what appears as material world and on what appears as mental states. But Bergson affirms that intuition has a privileged object, namely the mind. It is a point which is stressed several times in the creative mind. I quote Bergson, the intuition we refer to then bears above all upon internal duration. He also writes, intuition is the direct vision of the mind by the mind. So how can this be explained? It seems to me that the main reason is that according to Bergson, intelligence alone is very well adapted to the knowledge of matter, even if for Bergson, intelligence is not capable of a complete knowledge of matter, but it is very well adapted to this knowledge. But intelligence is very poorly adapted to the knowledge of the mind. So intuition is clearly needed for this knowledge. Second remark, according to Bergson, intuition grasps the indivisibility of change, both of external and internal change. Consequently, Bergson writes, to think intuitively is to think in duration. This assertion is also in the creative mind. But in relation to intuition conceived as a direct vision, the indivisibility of change is only a characteristic of what appears. So it is only because Bergson discovers indivisibility as a general characteristic of what appears that he advises the philosophers to be attentive to this indivisibility. in conclusion, even if Bergson affirms that intuition as a privileged object, the mind, and that it always grasps the indivisibility of a change, what characterizes intuition first is to be a direct vision of something. So a kind of acquaintance in the terms of analytic philosophy. I have characterized analytic philosophy by its effort to analyze language, and Bergson's philosophy by its effort to grasp what appears immediately to consciousness. Are these two efforts compatible? It seems to me that the answer is positive. And a simple proof of that is that in analytic philosophy, we already find ideas inspired by intuition in the sense of a direct vision of something. I'm thinking in particular of the argument of qualia in the philosophy of mind, because this argument consists precisely in taking into account what appears immediately to consciousness, for example, colors, flavors, emotions, feelings, etc., and in questioning a certain conception of the mind from that. Symmetrically, in Bergson's philosophy, we find a certain effort to analyze language. For example, at the end of Time and Free Will, Bergson makes an analysis of the term cause, distinguishing first an epistemological and an ontological sense of the word, and then two different ontological senses. Moreover, the distinction between specialized time and time as succession constitutes a certain analysis of the word time, even if this analysis is post-intuitive. That is the result of an intuition. In fact, more generally, the great conceptual distinctions that Bergson introduces in philosophy are post-intuitive distinctions. But we can say that, as in analytic philosophy, the goal of this distinction is the clarification of statements. When we speak of time, Bergson can ask, what are we talking about? When we speak about memory, what are we talking about? When we speak of morality or religion, what are we talking about? And the fact that Bergson explicitly defends clarity in philosophy. Now, if the efforts of language analysis and intuition are compatible, they can be added together to give rise to a philosophy that is both intuitive and analytical. But this addition obviously requires certain conditions. I see two of them. First condition, the rejection of the idea that philosophy can be reduced to the narrative of a vision devoid of analysis of language. And in other words, this is the need to distinguish philosophy from poetry. The second condition is the rejection of the idea that any direct vision of something is impossible or meaningless, with the consequence that philosophy must be reduced to the analysis of existing language. These two remarks echo criticism that some analytic philosophers have addressed to Bergson, as we can see in Andreas Vrahimis' book, Bergsonism and the History of Analytic Philosophy. I'm thinking in particular of the criticism that Schlick addresses to Bergson, and which said that the direct vision of something is not a form of knowledge. But thanks to Andreas' book, we see that Schlick finally admits that conceptual knowledge, including scientific knowledge, must be based on what is immediately given to consciousness, even if it doesn't use the word intuition. One last remark before moving on to the second part. According to Bergson, our capacity for intuition is rather weak, which implies that intuition alone risks leading the philosopher to erroneous conclusion. Fortunately, since the privileged objects of intuition and intelligence I mean mind and matter, are linked, the philosopher can confront the results of intuition with those of intelligence, that is, of science, in fact. Hence, the idea defended by Bergson that philosophy and science must control each other. I quote Bergson, let me repeat, what I wanted was a philosophy which would submit to the control of science, which is clearly interesting as an idea, and which in turn could enable science to progress. From this point of view, there is no reason to oppose Bergson to analytic philosophy by saying that only the latter would be close to science or respectful of science. Now I move to my second part entitled More Intuition in the Philosophy of Free Will. In this part, in line with what I said previously, I will try to show that analytic philosophy should become more intuitive without losing its analytic character. And I will try to show this on the specific example of free will. Within analytic philosophy, some works on free will inspired by Bergson have already been published. I am thinking in particular of the articles by Ran Lahave and Mark Robson, the book by Matthias Moravec, and my own article from 2024. In this presentation, I will only try to show how Bergson's approach to the problem of free will is intuitive. So it will be something very little compared to all these works. In analytic philosophy, the debate on free will is mainly between compatibilist and incompatibilist philosophers. For the former, free will is compatible with determinism, and for the latter, it is incompatible. At first glance, at least for a Bergsonian thinker, one might think that free will and determinism are incompatible. But in the analytic debate on free will, incompatibilism must face a significant difficulty, and I will return to this. On the other hand, since Bergson opposes free will with determinism, Bergson can be considered an incompatibilist philosopher. However, as I shall try to explain, Bergson defends a non-traditional form of incompatibilism. Non-traditional because different from what we find in analytic philosophy and different from what we find in classical philosophy, in fact, in particular in Descartes. And this difference is due to the intuitive origin of his approach. In analytic philosophy, defenders of incompatibilism represent free choice as a choice between two paths, A and B, already defined in the future, as we can see in figure 1. We can find this figure in some analytic philosophers, in particular in Robert Caine, and of course in Bergson, but in Bergson for a critical purpose. We must add that to these two paths in the future correspond some fixed ideas of action in the agent's mind, some fixed reasons related to these ideas, and a fixed rational preference for this or that idea. Fixed here means which does not change or which does not evolve. In other words, in traditional incompatibilism, an agent capable of free will has fixed ideas of action, and you just have to make a choice between these fixed ideas corresponding to fixed path in the future. The dilemma is then the following. If reaction causally depends on the agent's rational preference, then this action is predetermined by this preference. This is determinism. And by contrast, if reaction is independent of any rational preference, then this action appears as an arbitrary choice. This avoids determinism, but there is a problem because free action is conceived as produced by chance. So the fundamental problem of the traditional incompatibilism is that the defenders of this position are obliged to think of free action as a kind of chance, as implying a kind of chance, an element of chance. From Bergson's point of view, this problem is due to a static conception of the decision process. Schematically, the defenders of traditional incompatibilism represent this process as in figure 2. This conception is static because it concerns a fixed rational preference for this or that action, based on fixed ideas, fixed reasons, and more generally, a fixed psychological self. And if the cause of free action is totally fixed, then free action is predetermined by this cause, unless we cut the link between free action and its cause, and in fact, then we have chance. In contrast, the intuitive observation of the decision process leads Bergson to conceive of this process in a dynamic manner. Figure 3 aims to show this dynamic. In this figure, we see that throughout the process of reflection that leads us to free action, our rational preference and what underlines it evolve or can evolve. So we have a state 1 of our rational preference and our ideas, reasons, etc. A state 2, 3, 4, etc. And until a state n. And this dynamic is very important because it has a consequence. This consequence is that only free action puts an end to the evolution of our rational preference and what underlines it. In other words, only free action fixes this preference. In other words, only free action fixes the causal basis on which it depends. So there is a retroaction, in fact, from free action to its own causal basis. And this retroaction in the figure is represented by the black arrow. So in this conception, free action depends on a certain cause. There is no chance. It depends on a certain rational preference, in fact. But free action is not predetermined by this cause because this cause is fixed by free action itself retroactively. In other words, as Bergson explains in Creative Evolution, in free action, the cause is not totally separable from the effect. And you have also this idea quite clearly in L'évolution du problème de la liberté, the lecture at the Collège de France. Of course, the formation of the cause of free action begins before free action, in the sense that we begin to form our ideas of action, our reasons, etc., before free action. But the formation of this cause ends only with free action itself, at the very moment when free action is accomplished. Now, there is an objection to this position, to this conclusion from the dynamic view of the decision process. This objection is a determinist, is the following. A determinist philosopher can make the hypothesis that the dynamic process leading to free action obey deterministic laws, and therefore that the action ultimately invented and chosen by the agent is predetermined by these laws. Bergson discusses this objection at the end of chapter 3 of Time and Free Will. In fact, it is the end of chapter 3. And once again, he finds a possible answer to this objection in intuition. In this sense, Bergson explained that deterministic laws can only apply to typical causes or causes reducible to typical elements, as this is the case in physics. In physics, we have typical elements like mass, charge, etc., which only vary quantitatively. Now for Bergson and for intuition, in fact, it is far from obvious that mental states, especially deep states, are reducible to typical elements. For Bergson, intuition suggests that a deep state is indivisibly linked to the other states of the mind, and so that this deep state is irreducibly singular. And if it is irreducibly singular, it cannot obey deterministic laws. But only intuition, in the sense of a direct vision of the mind by the mind, can suggest this. Conclusion, which is only a brief recapitulation of what I said. In the first part, I tried to show that from the point of view of method, analytic philosophy and Bergson's philosophy can be characterized by two different but complementary efforts. For analytic philosophy, an immense effort of language analysis, and for Bergson's philosophy, an immense effort of intuition. In the second part, using a specific example, I try to show that analytic philosophy would benefit from integrating the Bergsonian effort of intuition. But in line, last remark, in line with what I said in the first part, I also think that a philosophy inspired by Bergson would benefit from integrating the effort of language analysis of analytic philosophy. Thanks for your attention.